My name is Martin from Arid.engineering. That's Armament Research and Industrial Design. I'm here courtesy of TnSteyr, Case Cook, and very much appreciate him loaning the studio for us to show you some things about the AUG today, or AUG, however you like to say it. So, as far as the AUG is concerned, there are a number of complaints or issues that folks have with the platform. Granted, it's over 40 years old and it needs some updates. That's not to say it's a bad firearm, it's an excellent firearm, but what we do at Arid is we take a different approach to modernizing or improving some of these older bullpups in these machines. So I'm happy to show you some things that we're going to cover in a couple more videos regarding the magazine release, trigger adjustments, trigger bar linkage, and trigger pack to improve some of the functions of the AUG. The big ticket items that are mainly complained about are trigger pull, sponginess, release, and some of the ergonomics that the AUG is found lacking when compared to some of its competitors out there in modern sporting rifles. So that's what we're going to cover. Alright, now we're going to cover disassembly of the AUG. It's basically two types. We have just basic field stripping, and then we're going to go into more detail of the actual internal components so you understand how the AUG works. It's actually pretty simple. So first thing that I gotta do is make sure the weapon's safe. I can see that it is on safe. I'm gonna take the magazine out, paddle release, and then check the chamber. It's clear. We're gonna start with the barrel. Barrel remover is pretty straightforward. We have to pull the charging back handle just back ever so slightly so that the locking pin stops impeding the barrel rotation. So we'll pull it back, hit our disassembly tab, rotates out, spring loads forward. At this point we can rest the charging handle and then just wiggle the barrel free up and out of the assembly. Next up, we need to disengage the takedown lug. The takedown lug is located right here on the side of the stock. It can only be pushed out one way and pushed back in the opposite way, and it is captive, so you don't have to worry about losing it. So what I like to do is put pressure on the receiver, pushing down into the table, and then with the other hand, push the takedown lug through the side. Once it's fully traveled on the outside, now I'm going to release pressure with my hand and allow the receivers to come out of the stock under the spring tension from the recoil springs. It comes out free, set it to the side, and as well as the bolt carrier group. So this little guy can go back into the stock so you don't snag it on anything. And then we want to take out the trigger pack. Trigger pack's pretty straightforward. We have this recess in the butt pad. We're just going to press in on it and then strip out the takedown pin. Set that to the side, and the butt pad, we now have access to our trigger group. It slides in and out of the stock fairly easy. And that covers basic disassembly. From here you can lubricate, clean, and service your firearm as you need to. Alright, so we did the basic field disassembly. Now we're going to cover the more in-depth disassembly of the internal components of the AUG. We're going to start with the trigger assembly. To standardize what we're going to talk about, we're going to go ahead and define some of the parts. First, we have the trigger pack. This is what came out of the rear of the buttstock, and it houses the entire fire control group of the AUG. Next, we have the trigger slide. This is the actual thing that you squeeze with your finger, your firing hand, to engage the trigger and fire the weapon. And it's called a trigger slide because it slides back and forth. It's pretty awesome. So I came up with that myself. And then we have the actual trigger linkage, which is the silver bar that you see inside of the stock. So all this works together to make the gun go bang, and we're going to figure out and show you how it goes together and some of the things we can do to it to make it work better. Alright, moving into the disassembly of these parts. We define them, so we're going to talk about them in those terms to keep you guys up to speed. Too easy. And we'll take our time, make sure we get all these pieces taken apart, understood, and explained so that you, when you put it all back together and make your adjustments, you understand what you are doing. That's the most important thing, so you don't get lost in that process or need help or make a mistake that you can't come back from. So again, take your time. Feel free to call Case or myself or reach out to us through email, and we will absolutely help clarify anything in this video that didn't make sense to you. So, which can probably happen quite a bit because I talk a lot. So, all right, continuing forward, I've got this nice Fixit stick tool, and it's actually pretty awesome. I eventually need to buy one of these. Thanks, Case, for making me buy something else. I'm going to go ahead and get the proper bit aligned. It's a number 3 metric, and we're going to remove the primary nut from the AUG trigger slide. So, pretty easy tool to use. I really like these. They have this small factor and large factor torque bits that help you properly torque your nuts and bolts. So removing the factory nut and washer, we want to keep these. We don't want to lose them. So put it right there so I don't lose it. What we just did is we just completely loosened the clamping power of the trigger. You'll see what I mean in a second. Now we can actually remove the trigger linkage from the stock. I like to use either a pair of pliers, or in this case forceps. I'm going to reach through the magazine well. I don't know if you can see this. So move the angle here. You can see the silver trigger linkage bars on either side of the magazine well. You can pick one or the other, it doesn't matter. But we want to grip it and then kind of push it along and pull it out the rear of the stock. So I'm going to get a nice grab here on one of these. Got it. I'm just going to pull, and now I'm very easily, handily removing it from the stock. You see it fall out the bottom here in just a second. Cool. So this is the linkage. So the linkage is made from bent steel wire. It's a heavy gauge wire. It's pretty stiff and strong, but nonetheless, the way it's manufactured can create some issues in terms of dimensions and tolerances, which affect your trigger pull. We'll talk about those in a second. So we have the linkage removed. Now we're going to take out the trigger slide. All this kind of interlocks together to keep the assembly together. So once this guy's out, everything else kind of just falls out of the gun, almost literally. So this right here is our trigger slide. And then we have the safety. Safety is the last thing to go out, and it's the first thing to go in. So when we go back into reassembly, don't forget your safety and the parts associated. We can push it out from either side. Here's the safety. And there's a small steel leaf spring which is held in by 2 little notches. I'm just going to shake, and the leaf spring comes out. We need to set these aside because we absolutely don't want to lose these. They're necessary. So working next, we're going to cover the adjustments that we can make on the trigger linkage and the trigger pack. But first we're going to show you how those go together. So going next, we're going to show you how all the pieces work together without the stock, so you can understand what's going on underneath the stock. So set that to the side. So we have our linkage, our slide, and our trigger pack. We'll put this right here. And let's say we just reassembled our linkage and our trigger slide together inside the stock. It's going to look something like this. We have the tongue of the linkage poking out the front of the trigger slide, right here, and we have the tail and these 2 prongs facing the rear of the gun. These 2 prongs are going to engage on 2 contact surfaces in the trigger pack. Looking at the trigger pack, on either side you can see this angled groove. It's the same on both sides. Inside this groove are the contact face surfaces of the sear. When those things are pressed down, they release the hammer. You see it moving? That's what your linkage is actually pressing up against to advance the sear and release the hammer. So what we want to make sure is that your linkage is touching both of those faces at the same time. On the linkage, from the way that it's manufactured, if either one of these prongs is even slightly longer than the other, that means that longer side is going to touch the sear before the other side. What does that mean? It means you feel slop and flexing inside of your AUG trigger. So to fix that, take very conservative passes with a file or a piece of sandpaper to even those out. You should only take material off the long side until they're completely even. If you get it too short, just even out the longer side. You have plenty of tolerance to work in because this trigger linkage can be adjusted forward and backwards to engage the sear properly. So after you make those adjustments, and Case from TnSteyr, this is his pack, he's already made those adjustments, so he's got a good linkage. What we want to understand is how these pieces go together. So I talked about before, this trigger linkage can move forward and backwards through the trigger slide. You can see me advancing it forward and backwards. Depending on this setting, we're going to have felt take-up and or preloading of the sear. We don't want either of those. What we want is for this linkage to be touching and only touching the face of the sear. We don't want it to be pressing the sear for pre-travel, and we definitely don't want it too far forward to where you feel slop in the system. Another way to explain that is this. When these parts are assembled in the stock, the trigger slide is in this position. It is going to be in this forward position when it is not being engaged. The trigger pack is always going to be right here, and it's held in this position as well. From a mechanical standpoint, these two components are fixed in their configuration prior to firing. The only variable here is the linkage. If this linkage is too far forward, it's no longer contacting the sear. If it's too far back, it's preloading the sear. We want it just right, just in the middle. So that's the adjustment you're going to learn how to make when we do reassembly. Okay, so far we've talked about basic disassembly. There's like 1,000 videos on YouTube on how to do that with the AUG. Then we talked about more in-depth disassembly of the trigger system and its components. Now we're going to talk about the main detractors for the AUG that we mentioned earlier. Number one being trigger pull, and number two being ergonomics. There's just simply better triggers and options out there nowadays that the AUG, still being 4 years old, needs to catch up to. And Steyr's going to hate me for saying that, so whatever. It's true. We all know it. Let's just face the facts. I still love this firearm. Anyways, so we already covered one of those big issues, and that is felt trigger slop in this stock AUG trigger. Some of that slop is due to the fact that the tail end of the linkage is from the manufacturer improperly cut or formed, where one end of the linkage is slightly longer than the other. It's an easy enough adjustment to make. Once you fix that, your slop improves or it goes away in some factors. Another thing is friction. So I was very recently reminded that these are not plastic components. They're a high-density polycarbonate fiberglass something. I'm not a chemical engineer, but it's not plastic. It's really durable material. In fact, the trigger components are made of the same material that the stock is made of, and they are absolutely durable, bomb-proof. So they're also easy to produce. So what does that mean, though, is that these things have friction, touching each other, moving back and forth. This is a linear action trigger, so the primary series has to track backwards inside of the pack and then reset this way in order for it to function. The trigger itself is also that same material. So what can we do to fix that? Lubrication. So because this is not metal, we do not want to use lubricating products that are corrosive in nature, like hydrocarbons or oils or WD-40s, that are going to cause breakdown of the material inside your trigger pack or in your stock and moving components. That's a big no-no. What is safe to use are approved greases published by Steyr in their Armor's course, and also dry lubricants like graphite powder. All we want to do is just put that on the contact surfaces of the different parts inside of here, and it decreases friction and increases the felt smoothness inside the assembly. So that's something we can do. You can also do the same treatment up here with the trigger slide, moving in and out of the inlet. It's already pretty smooth, but once we put everything together and you start feeling those forces as you squeeze the trigger, the bending and flexing inside of this assembly will cause plastic, or sorry, not plastic, but those materials to rub against each other and increase felt friction. So if we look at the trigger slide or trigger shoe, I already briefed you, we're only going to talk about it as the trigger slide, but it's also a trigger shoe. Inside of this stock, I don't know if you can zoom in here, there's a lot of felt, rotational, vertical, and forward and back play inside of this part. It can definitely move up and down freely. There's absolutely a lot of movement and play in here. So unless you have the upgraded components or access to different components, let's say this is all you're stuck with and you want to improve the felt performance of your AUG trigger, which is what we're going to cover next.